This is a teach-in for Platypus ANU. This is Daniel Lopez, the editor of Jacobin Australia. This is a teach-in on Lukács and his philosophy of praxis. Yeah, I guess we'll
Cool.
go into it.
Nice. Okay. Hello. Um, have you guys, so did you guys get a chance to do it, to have a look at any of the readings that I sent through? Like, that's all good. Familiar with Lukács at all?
A bit,
Okay. Yeah.
just general.
What have you read?
Um, Sort of just like vibes. I know he's very much about like sort of the sort of the start of critical theory, where he
Yep.
was sort of, I know, like buzzwords like
Yep.
reification, standpoint of the proletariat, stuff like that. But really, like everyone in Platypus really likes Lukács, but I really don't know much about him.
Fair. Yeah. Yeah, cool. All right. On the critical theory thing, he didn't really consider himself a critical theorist, but like the first Marxist work week was the thing, if you've heard of that. I think from memory it was in 1921, and it was like a gathering of like Marxist intellectuals from around Europe. The Russian Revolution was still relatively healthy, and they got some money off a rich supporter, and people like Walter Benjamin and Adorno were there. A handful of like Karl Korsch, and that is typically seen as the genesis of the Frankfurt School in critical theory. But I can say more about this if you're interested. But like people like Adorno, Benjamin, Horkheimer, they all went in their own way. Um, you know, but Adorno started out life as a Lucashian, and Benjamin was very influenced by Lukács as well. But yeah, the big turning point for those guys was when Lukács basically chose to stay loyal to the USSR,
Mm.
and those guys were not interested in that path. So, yep, cool. All right. Have you read any of Lukács?
No.
All good. Okay, so I'm just getting a sense of how to pitch the things I've got to say. Okay, so I'll start with the historical context and a little bit about Lukács, and then we'll talk about his philosophy of Praxis.
I did read your Jacobin article about him, though.
Legend.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a shitload of other stuff on Lukács out there, um, which is worth looking at. If you want me to send it to you, let me know. Like there's an article in Spectre, it's a US magazine, a short article in Commonweal, which is the magazine published by the Aotearoa Socialist Society,
The what?
a New
Oh,
Zealand
yeah,
Socialist
yeah.
Society. Yeah. Anyway, I've done a few different introductory pieces, and obviously I have a book on the topic. But go and read the original first. Um, the book is like I'll say maybe I can say more about that at the end, but it's a very sympathetic reconstruction of Lukács's philosophy of praxis, but from a Hegelian standpoint. So there is a critique of Lukács's philosophy of praxis, but it's a kind of typical Hegelian sublation kind of move that I'm trying to do. So yeah, and it's too big, the book. It's like 607 pages, so you know it's hefty.
Considering it was published in 2018, do you ever feel like you've moved beyond it, or like there's stuff in there that you change, or do you like was it just you
Hmm.
spent so much time on it that you're perfectly happy with it still?
Good question. Like Uh, I wouldn't really change anything in the book, no.
Mm.
I'm quite pleased with it as it came out. But like it is, the process for me was I started my PhD, my first PhD, because I'm doing another one, as a very orthodox, convinced Lucashian.
Mm.
And that goes back to my political commitments. I was social alternative still, but for me, that was a way to work through the philosophy of revolution going on behind the politics that they had and I guess the revolutionary Marxist movement in general had.
Mhm.
So throughout the first PhD, the turning point was when I started to develop a critique of Lukács's philosophy of praxis. Um, and I can say a bit more about that in the context of the um, paper I'm about to give. So the book very much reflects that. Like I said, it's not a hostile critique, but for me, Lukács was the way into philosophy proper,
Mhm.
which, in philosophical terms, I would not really call myself a Marxist. I don't think that there is a Marxist philosophy. There are philosophical things within Marx's work and within Marxism, like it's an implicitly philosophical body of thought. But I do think that Marxism has this um, difficult and negative relationship to philosophy. It tends to criticize philosophy as somehow bourgeois or reified or whatever. And I think that's partly why there hasn't been a fully developed Marxist philosophy. Um, so philosophically, I would say that I'm an absolute idealist. Obviously that refers to Hegel, but I don't just think Hegel's the guy that's got it right. Plato, I mean, too. You know, yeah. So politically, I would say I'm a Marxist. In terms of social theory or political economics, yes. Um, but yeah, I'll say more about this in a second. But for me, the standpoint of philosophy is a distinct standpoint, which it gives you an overview of different theoretical currents. So to give you a sense of what that means, for example, Marxism and psychoanalysis, right? So Marxism, I would kind of see as the psychoanalysis of society in a way. whereas psychoanalysis is the psychoanalysis of the psyche. And both are practically oriented intellectual movements, Marxism obviously to political practice, psychoanalysis to clinical practice, and both can develop to some extent a self-account, but neither can enable an overarching view that allows you to contextualize those, theoretical movements within history or to examine the conceptual logic going on behind them. I think philosophy does that. It gives you that. And to do that properly, you have to build it out of the actual elements that exist within Marxism, or for that matter, psychoanalysis. But yeah, when I read Lukács, I read him as basically pushing towards a standpoint of philosophy that then helps inform his intervention within Marxism. But anyway, let's get to that in time. So the historical context. Before Lukács became a Marxist, he's from a wealthy background. He's Jewish, Hungarian, but in his autobiography, he makes it fairly clear that anti-Semitism wasn't really a structuring factor in his life. And that kind of speaks to the specific role that Jewish people played in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. According to Lukács, I don't really have an independent view on this, Jewish people were largely assimilated within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and anti-Semitism wasn't a major current until later, and imported, I guess, from Germany. But his father was a banker, and Best Dad of the Year award every single year. He always had Lukács's back, gave him money, apparently kept a copy of History and Class Consciousness in his office, and was like, my son wrote this. Oh. So, that's cool. But Lukács was basically like a, classic, fin de siècle European sad boy existentialist from a wealthy background. He was really interested in art, in theatre. He was always more of a philosopher or a critic than, he never really tried to write literature or whatever. He was also very much a Germanophile, because Austro-Hungarian particularly was kind of a backwater in Europe. So, kind of like Australia is vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Read a book about Austro-Hungarian history and have a drink every time the Hungarians block a promising reform.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Get smashed. Yeah. So, he was very oriented to German culture and German intellectual life. And it was a good time to be oriented to that too, because German intellectual life was wildly interesting in that period. The main influences going on there would be neo-Kantian philosophy and neo-Kantian social theory. By neo-Kantianism, do you guys know what I mean?
I think of like Bernstein, that movement within the Social Democratic Party.
Oh yeah, huh. I haven't really connected those guys. Yeah, I guess that could be seen. Yeah, I mean that sort of fits vibe-wise. So neo-Kantian philosophy, Zindelband, Rickert, Emil Lask. There's some of the names. I haven't gone deep into neo-Kantian philosophy. Gillian Rose has an excellent account of neo-Kantian philosophy in Hegel Contra Sociology. But when I say neo-Kantian, it's not so much that they're orthodox Kantians. It's more that they systematize what do they do? Like the kind of relativism implicit in the Kantian project is really quite an important structuring principle for them. What I mean by that, let's take Max Weber and George Simmel as examples. So a typical method for Weber or Simmel, I'll do Simmel actually. The Philosophy of Money is excellent. It's a really good book. And it's a big influence for Lukács. But in that, in the introduction, Simmel very carefully says, what I'm going to do is I'm doing a philosophical aesthetic. That's the model. It's half philosophy, half aesthetic. And the heuristic, the lens I'm using is money. So it's, a historical anthropology of money, and it's a social theory of money. But when he says philosophy and aesthetics are the two parts of his method, he says, well, look, I'm using money as a lens, or as a frame through which to look at things. And he acknowledges that there's no necessary logical or rational reason for doing that. Hence, it's kind of an aesthetic choice. But he uses philosophy as the critical component to dissect the things that he discovers in the course of writing this big book about money. So the end result is this quite, beautiful and detailed picture of how money has evolved over time and how it structures our societies, in particular in modern societies. The one essay to read by Simmel, which is so good, is Metropolis and Mental Life. It's a banger. It's like 5 pages. And like one of the points in that is that the experience of living in cities and in monetary economies is crucial for the way modern subjectivity exists. Because money, and this is like pure Lukács stuff, money is quantifying. It relates very distinct qualities together on a purely numerical basis. And when that becomes the dominant social logic, congratulations, we're now in a reified society. We're in a society where everything is quantitatively valued, and the qualities of things sort of apart from that. And that can mean there's a fascination with quality, or the similar processes going on in cities because they bring together so many people, so many distinct ways of life. And again, that's quantifying, so it creates uniformity, but that, by contrast, creates an impulse towards individuality and towards what's unique, special, distinct, etc., etc. So the thing I was saying about the philosophy of money is the end result is you get this complicated overarching picture that does not make claims to talk about everything. It is kind of delimited, and the limits of that picture are irrational. That's the interesting thing about neo-Kantianism. So Weber does this as well, like he'll do social theory of bureaucracy, of the city, of any number of other things, and he'll build these very detailed and very informative pictures, but without making overarching claims in the way that a Hegelian might, or a Marxist might. So neo-Kantianism, basically, you could say it's a more relativistic methodology and social theory. But that was the going thing in Germany, and it was very rich and very detailed. And the neo-Kantian philosophers are, they're writing these massive tomes and, trying to expand on the basic problem in Kantianism, which is the relationship between the thing in itself and the thing for us. Anyway, that's Lukash's intellectual context. He also reads Marx before he becomes a Marxist, but he certainly understands capital, but he's not persuaded by it yet. It takes more life experience to do that. So World War I is quite decisive. He's appalled by the war and he opposes it, and he breaks with Zimmel because Zimmel supported the war. So did Max Weber. So, that's a major test for intellectuals in Europe at the time. And Mikhail Lowy has an excellent bio on Lucash, which has a very, very good short sociology of radical European intellectuals at this period. It basically went in two ways. You're either going to become a Bolshevik or a fascist. There's very little middle ground. And obviously, Lukács became a Bolshevik. As an aside, do you reckon I could borrow your water at some points? I didn't think to bring, or maybe, I don't know, we could take a quick break and I'll go and get my own. Yeah, I'm not, it's not urgent. I'll get there. Okay, so that's all happening. Next minute, 1918, Hungarian Revolution breaks out, and Lukács is inspired. He's recruited to the Hungarian Communist Party just before that by Béla Kun, if you guys know about him. Like the single worst communist leader in Europe's history, maybe, except maybe Zinoviev. We're not counting Stalin, obviously. Béla Kun was like a walking fuck up, like the cynical bureaucrat who would do and say anything to gain power, including positioning in a really ultra-left way, but not a sincere ultra-leftist, like Maslow or Fischer or something. Just a bureaucratic.
Just for context for Owen and the audience. So basically, do you want to just say the origin of the Hungarian Revolution in the fall of Austria-Hungary?
Yeah, good lord. It doesn't go well for Austria-Hungary in World War I, does it? And a lot of the questions that existed in the Russian Revolution are kind of similar in the Hungarian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a land question, there's definitely a question of minorities, national minorities, because it's a strangely cosmopolitan empire with different rights for each different national group. And there is, of course, a working class movement. The other big problem in the Hungarian Revolution is, weirdly, it was organised as a coalition revolution between the Social Democrats and the Communists, which is probably the reason why it didn't work well. I mean, who knows? Wishful thinking in history is always a bit questionable. But yeah, imagine a massive coalition of Social Democrats and Communists organising Soviets to take power. It's kind of...
And also it's like a nationalist thing to take back the territory of Hungary.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, but there was a major working class component to it. It was quite radical and transformative, and it was consciously modeled. They wanted to do the Russian thing. So Lukács was pretty impressed by this possibility. But anyway, he's recruited to the party by Béla Kun, and he's a significant intellectual at this point already. So he's got a profile, and But the thing is, in this era of his life, he was very much a romantic revolutionary. And that's an interesting point about Lukács's life. He's one of those guys that you can very clearly demarcate periods of his life, and he says this as well. So it's really not controversial to say there are these distinct periods in Lukács's life. The first period being existentialist, rich, sad boy. The sort of intervening period being romantic, quasi-Marxist revolutionary. What I mean by that is there are some wonderful anecdotes about Lukács during the Hungarian Civil War, which followed the revolution. One of them, he was really interested in Christian, Dostoevsky and existentialist Christian kind of stuff. In one account, he becomes Commissar for Culture during the Hungarian Civil War, and he does some cool things. He organizes groups of armed soldiers to go and seize art from rich people's houses, puts them on display for everyone. And those pieces of art are still in public ownership. So well done, mate. Redistributes theatre tickets from rich people to the working class. Reorganises the university system. Basically just cuts all the reactionary old weird Christian shit from the syllabus and makes sure that Marx gets taught. His position as Commissar for Culture was also very good on art. He insisted that a workers' government or a socialist government should not position itself as a critic. It shouldn't make political evaluations of art. It should simply facilitate art and leave the task of criticism to whoever wants to do it, really. So one thing he introduced, which I very much like, was so you're an artist, you're a writer, some other creative. If you can prove that you have an output, you're not just a dilettante, you'll get paid without any evaluation of the content of what you're doing. So you could be right-wing as hell, but if you can prove that you're doing it, you get paid, and then leave criticism to party papers and other independent publications and whoever wants to do it. But no, the thing I was getting to is so he's a Commissar for Culture, he's involved in the Soviet government, and during the Civil War, he goes off to the front lines. He becomes an officer, basically. On one level, he paid great attention to material realities. He made sure everyone got their mail. He made sure the field kitchens were working well. He understood that morale was important. He was also not above a little bit of, he wasn't above getting his hands dirty. I'm going to get to the main anecdote, but another fun anecdote is, prior to the Hungarian Revolution, he writes this essay called Bolshevism as a Moral Problem, in which he takes very seriously the idea of killing. He's not a utilitarian, and he condemns Bolshevism for their willingness to kill. Hungarian Revolution happens, he rewrites the thing. Tactics and Ethics, I think, is the new title, in which he just reverses his position. But, he doesn't become a utilitarian. It's never, for him, it's never, the greatest good for the greatest majority, therefore you've got to break a few eggs to make an omelette, sorry. It's not a quantitative question. He basically says, yes, killing is the ultimate crime, and we have to do it in full light of knowing how evil it is. And that's the only way that humanity will be redeemed. It's a quasi-Christian thing. And he quotes a Hungarian playwright, Hebel, and this playwright's version of the Old Testament story of Judith. Judith's Jewish woman. This is the period of the kingdoms of Israel and Judea. I think Judea is besieged by the general is Holofernes. I can't remember which people Holofernes is from. He's not Jewish. He's having a go at the Jewish kingdoms. Judea is besieged. It's looking very bad. And Judith goes into the enemy camp and gets Holofernes drunk, seduces him. They have a nice time, and then when he's passed out, she cuts his head off. And the famous painting of that is Artemisia Gentileschi, the most banging Renaissance painter, really. Kind of Caravaggio, but the radical feminist version. Anyway, so there's a Hungarian playwright, Hebel, who writes a version of the Judith story, and Lucash quotes Hebel and the line that Hebel has written for Judith. And she says, if God places a sin between me and his command, who am I to question God's command? So anyway, Lukács all of a sudden is definitely up for getting his hands dirty, but in a very existentialist sense. So, at one point he did have some Red Army members court-martialed and shot for desertion. So, he was up for that. But at another point, there's an anecdote that he insisted on walking above the trenches, in the middle of battle, because if he was going to attempt to take an enemy's life, he had an ethical duty to give them the chance to take his. And of course, his comrades just pull him back down in the trenches and tell him to stop being a fuckwit. But that gives you a sense of where he was at in that era. It's this hyper-existentialist, romantic, very revolutionary, but, we're not dealing with Lenin here. We're dealing with, a rich sad boy that's just converted and he's seen the truth of the future and he's up for it. Anyway, he's also at this point so the Hungarian Revolution goes very badly, the Civil War goes badly, they lose. Hungarian Communist Party its leadership goes largely into exile and has to organise underground. And Bela Kun, in his infinite wisdom, decides that Lukács, as simply one of the most prominent and well-known and recognisable members of the Hungarian Communist Party's leadership, must stay in Hungary. And, the idea being, it wouldn't be bad if this guy gets arrested and killed. But Lukács does stay, because he's a good communist. He does avoid that fate. From recollection, he manages to escape at one point by, I think, hiding in a trunk. He sort of smuggled out and eventually goes to Vienna. But the experience of organising underground and then the experience of organizing from exile, like that was a major force in pushing him towards a more developed and more grounded Marxism. His attention to concrete detail in Hungary is very few other academic commentators on Lukács talk about this, but like that pushes him towards a more grounded, more concrete position on politics. And so between 1918 and 1923, which is when History and Class Consciousness comes out, he's developing towards what I would describe as a kind of a mature Bolshevism. And he expresses that in a much more philosophical sense than anyone else from the time, because that's his background. But by 1923, I see him as a Leninist. He's no longer really a romantic revolutionary and ultra-left. And by ultra-left as well, he puts out a few essays prior to that, which are really good. They're worth reading, but they do have quite sophisticated versions of classically ultra-left positions. For example, we can't go into parliament because what the moment calls for is offensive tactics, et cetera, et cetera. Forget about the trade unions. We've got Soviets. These kinds of positions that were associated with the ultra-left current in European communism at the time. But he expresses them in way more philosophical terms, and they're more his defense is more sophisticated, so they're worth reading. But he's ditched all of that by 1923, partly as well because like Lenin name drops him in I think it's either Left Communism and Infantile Disorder or one or two of the articles Lenin wrote going into that. So he gets name dropped as an ultra left, and that hurts. But yeah, it's really the attention to the details on the ground that pushes him towards a more balanced position. And in the 20s, he worked very closely with another guy, Jenő Landler, who was a trade union leader, communist, obviously. But they basically formed the leadership of the Hungarian Communist Party, and in opposition to Béla Kun. I think I mentioned this perhaps in the Jacobin article or in another one of the introductory articles I've written. But to give you an example of what I mean by Lukács's grounded approach to politics in this era, Béla Kun, on instructions from Moscow, and like everything Moscow tells everyone to do in this period is wrong, like the main thing you have to do vis-a-vis Moscow is not listen to them, but still get their guns and money if you can. But Béla Kun tries to push through a policy. So we've got a dictatorship in Hungary, but the Social Democratic Party is legal. The Communist Party is not legal. And the setup is if you're a trade union member, a fraction of your dues go to the Social Democratic Party. Not dissimilar from Australia, the Labor Party, difference being Social Democratic Party is a mass workers' party, whereas Labor is absolutely not. And so Béla Kun tries to push through this motion in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, prohibiting communists from allowing their union dues to go to the Social Democrats. What does this mean in practice? It means in practice they're outing themselves as communists, making themselves liable to arrest. It also means that they're forfeiting the right to attend social democratic meetings. It means they won't be able to speak or vote or move motions. So they're losing a major forum in which they can talk to other workers. And in all likelihood, it may also mean that they forfeit their union memberships. So Lukács thinks this is just insane. Like the political justification, Béla Kun's political justification is right. Like the Social Democrats have played a basically reactionary role. I don't know if he uses the term social fascist, and I'm not sure if that's how he thought of them, but you don't need to use those terms to see that the Social Democrats were playing a bad role. But it's a mass workers' movement. You still have to relate to workers in them. Béla Kun's right in principle, but like grossly wrong in trying to relate principle to reality. Lukács, on the other hand, is like, guys, we obviously need to be in unions and we need to be talking to Social Democratic Party workers. So he wins that fight in the Central Committee, and that motion's not put through. So that's, for all Lukács is described as a romantic or ultra-left, like by the time he's got some real power in the Central Committee of the Hungarian Communist Party, he's pushing for very grounded things. To jump forward just quickly, the turning point with Lukács is, so I would say his philosophy of praxis era is really between 1918 and 1928. And by 1923, when History and Class Consciousness comes out, that's the most mature, detailed statement of his philosophy of praxis. 1928, there's a debate in the Hungarian Communist Party, which mirrors debates going on in other communist parties in Europe. It's basically, so in this period, it's the third line from Moscow, if you guys know what that means.
Social fascism.
Yeah. So the Comintern is putting forward this theory that social democrats are social fascists. What we need is an offensive. We need to push for insurrection, revolution as soon as we can. Basically, first the fascists, then us. That kind of idiocy. And Gramsci is also against this. Trotsky is also against this. Lukács is against this.
People.
Yeah, basically yes. Because there's dictatorships everywhere. Like revolution's not immediately on the agenda. The fight for democracy is on the agenda. And then maybe you can push for one to the other, which is obviously modelled on the Russian Revolution. So Lukács puts forward what's known as the Blum thesis in this period, because Leon Blum is his party name. Um, I think it was Leon. No, I think, yeah, Leon Blum. Anyway, the Blum theses are basically, an argument to the Communist Party that the main orientation should be united struggles, coalitions with Social Democrats where possible, and the fight for democracy against dictatorship. That loses. The third period supporters, Bela Kun supporters win. And in that period, if you lose a debate like that, you're not going to get shot, but it's not looking good. You may be expelled from the Communist Party quite soon, and then as the 30s roll on, you probably will be shot. So Lukács sees the way the wind is blowing, and at this point as well, he moves to Moscow. I think that's maybe in the very early 30s that he does that. Um, anyway, the details are all there in my book if you want to go and find the actual facts. Um, but he very consciously departs from politics. He stops trying to be a political leader. Doesn't mean he becomes apolitical, but that's the end of his direct political involvement until the Hungarian Revolution 1956 happens. He becomes Commissar of Culture again. It's cool. He always remains committed to workers' democracy, but his position vis-a-vis the USSR is that, and these are his words, the worst form of socialism is better than the best form of capitalism. So he quite consciously chooses to support the USSR as opposed to the rest of the world, takes up residency in Moscow, begins working on the Marx Engel archives. But it's a different period in his life and his career and his thought. He was also a very sincere intellectual. So, others changed their views and became completely cynical apparatchiks saying whatever they thought the bureaucracy needed to hear. Lukács, on the other hand, did the work of trying to think through why he was wrong. I disagree with him. I think he was wrong, but in other ways. But it's the work of a sincere intellectual, so he's trying to figure out where in his mind he went wrong and to develop a different Marxism that overcomes those problems. And the key books there would be Destruction of Reason, which, as Adorno said, is the destruction of Lukács's reason. Destruction of Reason is basically guys, after Marx, if you're not a Marxist and you're doing philosophy, you're a reactionary and probably basically a fascist. It's just this. I don't know. I don't like it. It's this polemical reduction of everyone interesting.
But you think this was a sincere turn on Lukács's part to support the Stalinist line? It wasn't just.
It was anti-fascist. He saw it as anti-fascist, and he's critical of. Well, the other book to read, the much better one, is the Young Hegel, which I have an article coming out in Historical Materialism about this. But so in that book, he traces the young the development of his views. So this is prior to Phenomenology of Spirit. But in particular, Hegel wrote a lot on Christianity. The Spirit of Christianity is wonderful. It's such a good essay. And there's this volume of Hegel's earlier writings on Christianity, which is really worth a look. I think it's got Hegel on theology or something. I don't know. But Hegel does this history of the development of Christianity from a quasi-revolutionary movement through to its institutionalization in the Catholic Church. Yeah. So Lukács is recounting all of this in exacting detail, talking about how, as a revolutionary, religious movement, then it becomes bureaucratized as the church rises. This means there's strict control over theology, over what's permissible, what's not permissible. It means some of the more radical elements in early Christianity. I don't know if you guys know, but early Christian communities were often sort of quasi-communist in the sense they insisted on sharing property. They weren't into marriage, those kinds of things. So from that to peak Catholicism, and it's he's just reproducing these massive quotes and also Marx quotes on the logic of bureaucracy and how bureaucracy has a monopoly over ideas and it's intellectually stultifying and it has an interest in surveilling everyone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you read this and you go, could this be about the USSR? Possibly. And that's the young Hegel. But in it as well as an attempt to figure out where Marx broke from Hegel and to locate the genesis of Marxism in that break. That's a different version of Marxism to his philosophy of praxis. So I'll get to this when I talk about philosophy of praxis properly. But what makes Lukács's philosophy of praxis a really interesting version of Marxism is if you think about the different truth claims involved in different types of Marxism, there are a few different candidates. So, you've got your real shitty, Second International ultra-scientific Marxism, which is Marxism as a natural science. You go David Attenborough and you go and look at a monkey really in a lot of detail and you're like, wow, this confirms Marxism. I'm like, no, it doesn't. Marxism is not a natural science because society is not natural. So if you say Marxism is a natural science, you're now committed to empiricism, you're now committed to sense data as the main source. Now you're committed to importing weird naturalistic theories into Marxism, you're probably going to talk a lot about the evolution of society. Or you could be like Marxism is an empirical economic science, in which case you're probably closer to someone like Bukharin. What you do then is you just amass a shitload of economic statistics, and that's, we've understood the agrarian problem. That's Marxism. And obviously Marxists need to do that. But the truth claim involved in that is an empirical data, the facts of bourgeois society. Lukács can't stand that. He's got a critique of Bukharin on this topic. This little review he wrote in the 20s. But every selection of facts presupposes a theory. The facts are never neutral. Like, what's a fact? I've never seen a fact. If I go out and try and collect a bunch of facts, they're obviously going to support the view that I'm arguing for, which isn't to say there's no point to if you're serious about facts and about empirical studies, then yes, you are looking for evidence, genuine evidence, but to stake Marxism as a movement on that kind of truth claim commits you to a reality which is a bourgeois reality. It commits you to reading reality economically in terms of its facts. That's an aspect of reified existence, let's talk about in a second. And, it's a kind of scientific Marxism. There are other truth claims involved, other truth claims Marxism can and has made. But in the 20s, Lukash's version is it's Praxis that makes Marxism true. I.e., until there is a workers' revolution, well, then there has been, 1917, until that point, Marxism was a theoretical hypothesis, and therefore necessarily utopian, necessarily a bit vague. But the thing that has confirmed Marxism is the actual praxis of the working class, i.e. the October Revolution. It's like a philosophy of the event. It's, glad you would be the contemporary philosopher that does this kind of thing. Which is a radically different truth claim to other Marxisms. It's much more historicist. It locates the truth of Marxism in an event. And then the problem becomes, well, what do you do after the event? You simply recall it.
Or if the event doesn't work out.
Bingo, yeah. So, but anyway, that's the philosophy of praxis, which is a really radical and interesting version of Marxism at the time. And it's got grounds in early Marx, for sure. It's very compatible with like the theses on Feuerbach and Marx's early writing. Marx himself never really hedges his bets on one account. Like there's no coherent account of philosophy in Marx. He says different things at different times, and you can, he was a hot mess. That's what's fun about him. Engels, on the other hand, let's not talk about Engels. Engels was a very good friend. It's the main thing.
Not a fan.
Just not a fan. But like his Marxism, he's a shitter thinker. There's books, absolutely go and read Engels, but the Ludwig Feuerbach and the, Ludwig Feuerbach, the end of classical German philosophy. Yeah, that's the origin of the line that guys, philosophy's over, don't do it. It's now Marxism or you're reactionary.
Dialectics of nature is sort of as a natural science.
Yeah, exactly. That goes to Engels. Yeah. And Marx was okay with it because he was great mates with Engels, and he was just like, yeah, this is all great anyway, so could you send me money? And also, what do you think about this draft of Capital? So Engels is a very good friend. Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of where Lukash's philosophy of praxis stands. The different truth claim involved in Lukash's later Marxism is that Marxism emerges from Marx's break with Hegel. And that's where so the key difference there is the standpoint of the proletariat. I'll talk about this properly in context in a second, but the more radical philosophy of praxis version of the standpoint of the proletariat is that it is only actualized and it only becomes true in a moment of revolution. So that involves the claim about the standpoint of the proletariat, but it's hedging its bets on the revolutionary moment. Whereas later on, Lukash's view is, from the moment the proletariat exists as a social class, it is possible to look at the world from the standpoint of the proletariat. And Marx does this by generating the labour theory of value and the critique of political economy. And from that moment on, Marxism becomes and remains the only true paradigm. So there's no reference whatsoever to revolutionary praxis or events as what vindicates Marxism. It's simply Marxism becomes true as a result of the true existence of the proletariat, which, you could do worse as a philosophy, but you could do better, which is what we're talking about. Cool. Okay, so that's the historical context and background. So in this period, the major work is History and Class Consciousness, and that was put together out of essays that were written previously, but he did edit them quite a bit to go into History and Class Consciousness. It's a wonderful book. The other books that I think, the other key book in this period is his book on Lenin, Lenin, A Study in the Unity of His Thought, which is shorter and, it's very compelling. And, you only need a bit of a background on the Russian Revolution to get that one, but if History and Class Consciousness seems daunting, that is the text I recommend. It's really one of the best philosophical readings of Bolshevism out there. And as an aside, that's what Lucash does vis-a-vis Bolshevism that no one else does. he reads it philosophically. He's the philosopher of the October Revolution. Gramsci would be the person that comes closest, but Gramsci wasn't really a philosopher proper. He read Bernardetto Croce and other Italian Hegelians, like he knew what he was talking about, but the prison notebooks have stuff on philosophy in them, but they're much more scattered and they're more sociological.
What would you say is the difference between Lukács and Gramsci that makes Lukács more of a philosopher than Gramsci?
No, he knew philosophy a lot better. He wrote much more comprehensively on it. He was across classical German idealism, so everyone from Kant through to Hegel.
So it's a more systematic.
Yeah. He makes a clear-cut intervention into philosophy, whereas Gramsci makes comments about philosophy along the way. But Gramsci's, like prison notebooks are wonderful, but there's way more about Italian history, about sociological observations, political observations. They're also way less systematic, which obviously is not old mate's fault. Like he was literally writing from prison. Whereas history and class consciousness. In the preface, Lukács in one sentence says it is a systematic work, and the next sentence he says it's not. What's it to be? It wasn't written in the same way that Capital is, or Hegel's logic is. Yeah, so like it's not an exacting, imminent presentation of concepts. It's somewhere between system and non-system. An essay is like the least systematic version of philosophy would be aphoristic philosophy, like Nietzsche. Yeah, perhaps we can impute a system to that if we like. The most systematic being hard systematic philosophy, i.e. Hegel. On the spectrum from aphorism through to system, there's essay. An essay is like a glancing blow, or it implies a totalizing picture without articulating it fully. Closer to the logic, there's Capital, which is meant to be an imminent presentation of the concepts of political economy. Lukács's History and Class Consciousness is somewhere in the middle. And my argument was we can read it systematically, and my book was an attempt to reconstruct it systematically. There's grounds for that within the text, within what Lukács says, but the reality is it's not fully systematic. It's very enthusiastic. It was, written in a hurry, which is partly what makes it a great read. So anyway, there's also the book on Lenin and his essay, like other articles and essays. There's a little verso edition called Tactics and Ethics, which has his writings from prior to History and Class Consciousness. Great, very good to read. And the other one that's worth reading only came out recently, well, like a few decades ago, but The Defense of History and Class Consciousness. And that was a manuscript that Lukács submitted for publication to a communist journal, I think based in Moscow, but it was written in 1926 from recollection. And it was suppressed, it never came out, but it was rediscovered in the late 90s, translated. It came out in 2001. But that's really good because, History and Class Consciousness went down like a lead balloon. Everyone hated it. Yeah. And there's this insane, popular front against Lukács. Everyone, Adorno on the one hand to peak Stalinist philosophers, to peak social democratic philosophers, they all just, they can all agree we fucking hate History and Class Consciousness. And they all accuse Lukács of being an ultra-left. That's garbage. The other thing they accuse Lukács of is denying the existence of nature and denying that there is a philosophy, that Marxism can have a philosophy of nature. He simply doesn't. He simply says that natural dialectics are a subordinate field to social dialectics, and that to talk about dialectic of nature presumes that you already have a viewpoint of dialectics, which is a social and historical thing. So yes, once we have dialectics, we can use that to look at anything we like. But dialectics for Lukács do not emerge from natural science. Rather, they're a social way of looking that we can then use as a paradigm to understand natural science. And he's very explicit. Yes, you can do this. It's fine. There is a dialectic of nature if you like. It's just that dialectic is not grounded in nature. And so Defense of History and Class Consciousness goes through that in a great deal of detail. Today, to say that Lukács denies nature is just basically you've outed yourself as an idiot who doesn't read. But for most of the 20th century, the dominant line on Lukács was pretty garbage. There are exceptions to that. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of, sort of broadly speaking, one of the French existentialists, but very radical politically, has a wonderful book, Adventures of the Dialectic, and his chapter on philosophy of praxis in that is excellent. That's one of the best early readings of Lukács. Who else? Mikhail Lowy, as I mentioned. Andrew Feenberg, who's an academic, he reads Lukács very fairly. That was in the 80s that he first started to do that, but he's got a recent book. But anyway, in terms of the reception of Lukács, the context has changed. These days, the kind of reductionist and shit readings of Lukács are very much the minority, and a much more grounded, accurate reading of Lukács is the mainstream. And my book was part of that. There's been 4 books that have done this. Anyway, so now let's talk about what's in History and Class Consciousness. Cool. Any questions on this stuff before I do that?
just to like clarify, so you're sort of periodizing Lukács and having sort of this romantic view, and then sort of this philosophy of praxis, history of class consciousness view, and then sort of oppose that Stalinist view, and you'd sort of say that you're mostly influenced by the history and class consciousness,
Yeah.
that sort of era between the romantic and
Yes.
the Stalinized
Yeah.
Lukács.
Yeah, like I would hesitate to call Lukash a Stalinist, but like he definitely has a, but yeah, it's also not wrong. It's
Mm.
like, would be my take. Like, um, he positions himself as an orthodox Marxist.
Mm.
His relationship to the regime is very sketchy. They don't like him because he's sincere as an intellectual and a philosopher, but he's kind of too big to kill. But like he constantly is worried that he'll be dragged out in the middle of the night and shot. One of the famous stories, like he kept a bag packed. Uh, I love this story. During World War II, like he's in Moscow, and he keeps a bag packed. And his wife Gertrude Bordstreiber, he explains to her that like they could come for me at any moment. And then one night the knock on the door does come, and it's the whatever the checker. It wasn't called the checker. Yeah, was it the GPU at that point? I don't remember. But the Stalinist secret police turn up, and there's Comrade Lukash. You need to come with us. And he gives his wife a hug, and he picks up his bag, and they take him to a military prison, and they show him into this room, and it's full of like Nazi high commanders that have been captured. And they're like, Comrade Lukash, you're going to teach these Nazis the genuine German tradition. You're going to teach them Goethe and Kant. I know, it's bonkers.
Is that real?
Yes, it's real. It happened. Definitely happened. It's in Lukash's autobiography that he talks about it. It says like, okay. Like, let's start with Goethe. The idea being you could try and convince these Nazis, to not be fucking Nazis. Teach them that there's a German literature that's progressive. Anyway, that happens. But
Let go down.
I have no idea how it went down. I don't imagine well.
No.
I think you're going to do something with the German high command that you captured, like, just inflict Lukács upon them. Quite funny as a novel form of torture. You know, as an aside, that's one aspect of his relationship with the USSR. He can teach at universities, and like the book on Hegel, you can also read it as a simple intervention into Soviet academic life, staking the claim that we should still read Hegel. Because like in peak Stalinism, the line went around that Hegel's an aristocratic reactionary, and he's a progenitor of fascism. So it's obviously that's insane. But like Lukács is also defending just philosophy. But he teaches people. Like Agnes Heller was his most famous student, and she founded what's known as the Budapest School in Australia. Her and her students leave Hungary from memory in the 60s. They turn up in some in Sydney and some in Melbourne. And Agnes Hell actually lived in the suburb where I was a teenager. I grew up as a teenager, and she taught at La Trobe, where I teach. Yeah,
Thinking of restarting Budapest School?
No. I like Agnes Heller a lot, but those guys were not interested whatsoever in Lukács' political philosophy. They're more interested in his literary criticism, his aesthetics, those kinds of things. Agnes Heller's great to read, but like she's not someone I feel no one's really a Hellerist or Hellerite or something. Like she's not a philosopher that really ever created a movement. Maybe a parallel would be Hannah Arendt, someone like that. Like wonderful to read, but not really a movement person. Anyway, so he's a teacher as well. In 1956, there's another fun story about him. So he becomes a member of the anti-USSR Soviet government in Hungary. And following that, he's expelled from the Hungarian Communist Party. So again, sketchy relationship with the regime. It's obviously in the 1956 revolution is defeated by the Russians. And then he's also dragged out at one point, and he's taken to a castle in Romania somewhere, where he's imprisoned for a hot minute. But he's released, and apparently upon his release, he commented to his wife, "Perhaps Kafka was right all along." And have you read The Trial by Kafka, Franz Kafka? It's wonderful. It's like it's peak modernism. It's so good, but it's just this profound critique of the logic of bureaucracy.
Oh yeah.
And in the literary stakes, Lukács was always conservative. I've never read. I didn't care that much about Lukács's literary criticism. In the 1920s, he's not doing much of it. He sort of goes back to that afterwards. But his taste in literature is just, basically it's like realism. The only good thing is realism. So like, Thomas Mann. I like Thomas Mann. He's great. But like, there's more to life than realism. But as part of that, Lukács is quite famously hostile to modernism as a literary style, and Kafka is very much a modernist. So for him to come out of prison and go, maybe Kafka was right, is a fun concession. So anyway, he's got this sketchy relationship with the regime. That's on the one side. On the other side, and also as part of that, he's consistent throughout his entire life that socialism has to be built on workers' democracy and workers' councils. So, in that sense, he's not a Stalinist. In the sense that he is a Stalinist, he forms the left he's like on the left of the permissible, in terms of US, the Soviet world's intellectual culture. So yeah.
Do you think the like joining in the 1956 revolution shows that he did have some like reservations, or do you think there still was a genuine change away from his earlier, more radical views towards sort of Stalinism?
There's a genuine shift.
Okay.
Like, yeah, that's clearly expressed in like the young Hegel. Like, he's not Stalinist in the sense that he's always got a critique of Stalinism proper, and then once that becomes possible in the USSR following Stalin's death, he's allowed to articulate it. He remains consistent that the USSR is a better form of civilization than the West. He's very clear on that. So if you consider that Stalinist, then he's a Stalinist. But he's also very consistently for workers' democracy. So this is not Stalinism. I just see him as a committed and genuine socialist. Probably disagree with him about the USSR. Certainly doesn't pass the "would I live there" test. But I do agree with him that it's the worst form of socialism. My view on that question is, the classic Trotskyist debates: what's the mode of production in the USSR? Is it a degenerated workers' state? Is it state capitalism? What if they were the same thing? Like, I just think state capitalism is the worst form of socialism. It's what Marx calls crude communism in the 1844 manuscripts, because the immediate negation of bourgeois private property is state property, in which the state becomes the bourgeoisie. So it's capital without capitalists. And so what's the transition between that and genuine socialism is the democratization of all of society and the economy. That's my view. Like, conceptually speaking, maybe a state capitalist economy is, economically speaking, better than a free market capitalist economy. Politically inferior, because they haven't figured out how to do democracy. Not that bourgeois democracy is amazing, but anyway. That's Lukash's periods. So we should talk about history and class consciousness.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so everyone hated it. The thing is, so its purpose, very much the context that a lot of academic commentators miss, is he was responding to the failure of European communist parties to lead revolutions like the October Revolution, and in particular the 1923 attempted revolution in Germany. He's acutely aware of this failure, and he thinks that there's something wrong with Marxist theory in Europe that means they haven't been able to translate Bolshevism into other languages. That sort of refers to a famous Lenin quote. They haven't been able to figure out how to do what the Bolsheviks did. And his response to that problem is uniquely philosophical, which is cool. If you think about the way that Trotsky responds to this problem, he's basically like, right, what we need to do is we need to copy Bolshevism as a political program. And like he's just this programs guy. And he gets a lot of things right politically, but it's extract a political program, apply that elsewhere. Yeah. Gramsci's sort of closer to the Lukács position, but it's more historical, sociological, etc., etc. Lukács's view is, in order to translate Bolshevism, we need to read it philosophically and theoretically. And we need to develop a theoretical method that allows us to develop our own Bolshevisms in our own countries. And for him, that's a theoretical and philosophical question. So history and class consciousness is aimed at the leaderships and the cadre of the communist movement. It's not aimed at the mass of workers. It's aimed as a theoretical intervention in the communist movement. They all hate it. It doesn't work. And these days, there's never been a Lukashian party. There's no Lukashian movement within Marxism. It's an intellectual position. And that's its significance, I think. So the actual significance of history and class consciousness is philosophy. It's never had a political impact, which is fine. Not everything does have to, just in the same way as there's simply no good writing by Lenin on philosophy. Like, it's all garbage. Like, that's fine. I don't expect him to be a good philosopher as well. Like, he was pro-philosophy. That's enough. So anyway, so the overall structure of it is the first few essays of history and class consciousness are, sort of they're just very, fluid and supple expressions of Marxist theory, closely aligned with early Marx stuff. The essay on class consciousness is great, but the middle section is really the key one, and that's the essay on Reification and consciousness of the proletariat, antinomies of bourgeois thought, and then the standpoint of the proletariat. That's probably the most important single thing by Lukács. And then the final parts of history and class consciousness are applying that philosophy to questions of organisation. He's got a critique of Rosa Luxemburg. He's got an interesting thing on historical materialism. And then the final chapter is about Bolshevism and the organisational questions. So that's, the structure of history and class consciousness as, when you read the table of contents, is Marxist theory, hard philosophy, politics. That's how it looks. My reading reverses those terms a little. So I would start with his sociology, with the concept of reification, and this is what I'm about to go through. Then I would then go to political theory, then finish with philosophy. And within that reordering that's the Hegelian move. Because of course Hegelian philosophy culminates with philosophy, which isn't to say philosophy is the thing that changes the world. It's quite consciously not, but it's a vantage point with which we can look at attempts to change the world. So anyway, I say that because in the summary I'm about to give, that's the order I use. I start with reification, I end with philosophy, which is different to the ordering that Lukács gives the thing. So reification, that's obviously like probably the most famous concept associated with Lukács, and it's really his most novel contribution to Marxism. There's grounds for it within Marx. I think Marx uses the word reification once. There's all these turgid debates about what Marx meant and commodity fetishism, the value form and alienation. Are these things different? And also objectification. Anyway, I think all that's a bit dull, but it is useful to compare reification with alienation. On my reading, and I think this is in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács has a later critique of his own earlier position. I think it's a bad critique. You can find paragraphs in History and Class Consciousness that do the very things Lukács later on says that he doesn't do. But leave that aside. I would argue that alienation is the transhistoric logic to why we are separated from the power structures and things that we produce. So a feudal society is alienated. Rome is alienated. In the sense that in a feudal society, peasants or stonemasons might build a church and then worship it, or worship, and then serve the priests basically that run that church. Well, why is a king seen, royal and noble? Well, that's just an alienation of human capacities and an investment of those in the figure of a king. But the logic of feudal societies is not quantitative. It's much more qualitative. There is exchange, but it's peripheral to the main economic logic. The main economic logic is the extraction of rent from domination of land. This is why conquest of land is so important in the feudal period. I'm really simplifying a lot of history here, but bear with me. These are not economically organized societies. There is an economic element to them. They have to produce, obviously, but the logics are far more qualitative. God, bloodlines, castes, these kinds of things. Whereas the moment capitalism becomes the dominant economic form, once it hegemonizes the totality of a given society and now the world, we're dealing with the era of reification. So reification is a distinctive form of alienation specific to capitalist societies, and it is a quantitative logic that is built on money and commodity production. So it's leveling. In a sense, it's egalitarian, because money relates completely distinct use values and qualities together. And so what are examples of this? Well, Lukács cites one drawn from Max Weber, but if you think about how the courts work, so the overall logic of the social totality is quantitative, but that emerges in determinate ways in subordinate spheres. So the legal apparatus is one, but so there is a distinctive logic to law. For example, it has to be self-coherent. It has to build on itself. But at the same time, what does a court do under capitalism? Well, you've got a regular and predictable series of statutes that a business can look at and understand clearly, and you more or less know what outcome you're going to get, and the stress is on regularity and uniformity and predictability of outcomes. And so this is a framework whereby different members of the bourgeoisie can relate to each other as equals. Or individuals in society can relate to each other as equals. It's not like feudal law in which like some unhinged noble who's drunk half the time gets to decide, or a church, they fucking dunk a witch in a pond and declare that she's possessed. No, it's rationalistic. It's formalized. That's reification. What are other examples of this? Like just the standard, quantitative, like AI. But all the talk about AI, like the idea that you can reduce consciousness to an algorithm. This is just peak reification. So the logic of capitalism is reification. It's a quantitative logic. What that does is it tends to exclude the qualitative, right? So quantity, quality, these are two antinomies. And are you familiar with the concept of an antinomy, like a necessarily interrelated conceptual pair? Yeah, like freedom and necessity would be another famous one in the Marxist movement. Is and ought is a classic Hegelian antinomy. Anyway, so the qualitative element tends to get excluded. This does not mean it doesn't exist. It does exist. So how does quality recur in a reified society? Well, you go to work and you organize, that work is organized quantitatively, hours, outputs, what have you, metrics, depending on where you work. Why do you do it? For love, to keep your family going, because, you'll have free time on the weekend. So that's the element of quality that still exists. It exists in personality, in private life, in love, in art, so on and so forth, that are excluded. And that can be a form of oppression and exploitation as well, like the family, like unpaid labor reproducing, reproductive labor. Well, it's qualitative. It's not economically valued. You do it for love. And, women do it more still. So, this is part of the arrangement of culture and society and production under capitalism. The qualitative element is excluded. So we've got a picture so far of reification as having two sides, qualitative and quantitative, yeah? And this is like a social theory or a sociology. And, you can do that. It's got huge explanatory power. Within that, there's a subjective and objective side to reification. Yep. And the subjective side talks about individuals and how we relate to our lives. The objective side would be more about social logics. So, to look at an economy and how an economy functions or an economic crisis, that we're talking about the objective logic of reification, how reification plays itself out in different spheres of society. Yeah. Well, within the subjective side, Lukács argues that reification basically the immediacy of our subjective experience in a reified society is the contemplative stance. Our relationship to the social whole is contemplative. Now, what he means by that is not necessarily passive, but rather he means that it's abstract. We cannot have any meaningful control over social processes or the social whole by virtue of our reification within them, that we're organised as individuals, fragmented, etc. We don't know the logics that are occurring most of the time because they occur without anyone choosing them. They just are, and they seem natural. Well, that's another element of his argument about reification. It's naturalizing. It makes society appear like nature. It means that our relationship to society takes on a naturalistic element in that, we regard society as almost a natural phenomenon that we then need to understand and study and fit within. That's the contemplative stance. So I think what's one of the examples I use in the Jacobin article, the contemplative stance occurs differently for different individuals depending on their class background, their culture, their proclivities, if you will. But take a Silicon Valley guy. Fucking on one hand, hyper rationalized, hyper quantitative, like efficiency, algorithms will do everything, AI will do everything, blah, blah, blah. Next minute, they're at Burning Man off their tits on 3 tabs, wearing an insane costume. That's the qualitative. And that person can be hyperactive in a sense, but their relationship to society is still a contemplative one because they're still subject to social laws that they did not produce and that they simply embody. And for that person, the contemplative stance is a source of power. So for the bourgeoisie, it's a source of power. Even though it's incoherent and contradictory, it's necessary to their power. For someone who's middle class, it's neither nor. It's necessary to their lives. There's no basis within their lives to go beyond it. And they're not necessarily going to be happy about it all the time. I don't know. It's a generalized picture. Whereas for Lukács, it's the standpoint of the proletariat that allows you to overcome the contemplative stance, intellectually, but as well practically. And to overcome the contemplative stance practically, now we're talking about collective organising, collective power, working class power, strikes, general strikes, political stuff, revolution, etc., etc. But before I get to that, when we're talking about the standpoint of the proletariat to begin with, we're talking about an intellectual imputation to the proletariat. Yeah? What do I mean by that? Well, what Lukács is looking for is a location in society where subject and object are identical, where they're united, where the divorce between subject and object, between individual and social totality, can be broken down. Yeah? And you can't find this for Lukács in the way of life of a member of the bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie as a social class. You can find it in the experience of work for the proletariat. But this is an intellectual position at this point, and this can exist regardless of what the proletariat is doing in any given moment. So this does not mean that the whole proletariat is communist and up for a revolution. It's just as true in a society where the proletariat is completely atomized and, right-wing. But the reason why there's an identity of subject and object in the proletariat, and in saying that, it's not a fully developed unity of subject-object. It's an identity. It's an immediate whole that hasn't been thought through yet. And Lukács does think it through. We'll get to that. This exists in the experience of work. Yeah. So work, as we've said, is quantitative. It's about the extraction of labour according to time. That's under capitalism. It's different from other ways of organising work. It's valued monetarily, and obviously labour power is the commodity. Labour itself is the use value, and the difference between the value produced by the value embodied in the commodities that workers produce and what they're paid for their labour power. That's the genesis of exploitation. Yep. So should I break that down a little?
Maybe a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, cool. This is sort of like chapters 1 to 3 of Capital kind of stuff, but like Lukács endorses that and speaks about it. So when you go to work, you're producing things, objects or services, as it were. And if you're working for a successful business, that business will, or university, institution, that business will sell the things that you're producing that has market value. Yeah, you're producing things that are useful, ideally, but they're valued according to the market. And overall, like labor theory value and the socially average, socially necessary labor time. That's another point. Well, then how are workers paid? Well, workers are paid according to the value of the commodity that they're selling to a capitalist, which is their labor. And this is actually key to Lukács's argument, right? Because what's the difference between a worker and a serf, or a worker and a slave? Well, a slave is the direct property of their lord. Yeah, a serf is bonded to their lord, and therefore the products of their labour are obligatory. They're obliged to give some of those to the lord. So we're not dealing with labour as a commodity in either of those two examples. With workers, we are dealing with labour as a commodity, which means the worker is free. You can sell your labour to anyone. It's a classic Marx kind of point. But you might, and if you don't want to, well, you've got that right too. You can sleep on the street. But this means that to go to work, the worker has an experience of abstract freedom, of capitalist freedom. Yeah, they will themselves to go to work. It's their choice to sell their labour. Now, the trick with exploitation is labour power. Well, how is that valued? Well, it's valued according to the socially necessary labour time to reproduce labour, which, is very variable. Like it means, if workers strike and demand higher wages, then congratulations, we as a people have decided that the socially necessary labour time required to reproduce those workers is higher. But for a capitalist firm to be successful, the value of the commodities it's selling has to exceed the inputs of production, including labour power. So workers are producing more value than they're being paid for, simply. They're being paid to their labour as a commodity. What they're producing is more valuable than that, and that's the plus value. That's the secret of exploitation under capitalism. What's a concrete example of this? I don't know, you work at a bar. If you work at a bar, calculate the value of the drinks that you've poured over the course of a night, then subtract the rent, subtract the bulk price of that alcohol and the other expenses of the business, then subtract your wages and what's left over. That's the amount that you're being exploited by. And it's, yeah. If you're at a university, look at how much students are paying for their degrees and then how much you're being paid as an academic. There's going to be a gulf. And if there's not a gulf, that business is not one that's going well. It's going to fail. Anyway, so to go back to Lukács, what's key about work is, so it means the individual member of the proletariat is subsumed under this quantitative logic, exploitation of labour power according to time in the workday. But there is a qualitative element in it insofar as they will themselves to do this. They choose to do this, which means ultimately the working class is a free agent of its own exploitation. But in virtue of that, they can decide not to be, because the experience of this is harrowing. And we're talking about like fucking early 20th century industrial workers here. So like it's probably, the equivalent today would be, workers in China that produce iPhones. But like there's obviously experiences of this in the West still, just because, the argument still holds in a situation where workers' rights are more developed. So it's basically the experience of work that, for Lukács, is the starting point of why the proletariat can be a revolutionary opponent to capitalism and the subject object of history. But to get there, we have to do a series of other mediations. And by mediations, I mean the conceptual links between, antinomies and between concepts. So the standpoint of the proletariat, as I've articulated it, and for Lukács, is to begin with a theoretical standpoint. It's imputed to the proletariat by Marxist theorists. It is not a description of what workers actually think. There is a concept for that within Lukács, and it's called empirical class consciousness. So we have imputed class consciousness, which is a theoretical reading of the abstract interests of the working class and their abstract historical potential. And I say abstract because insofar as the standpoint of the standpoint of the proletariat is theoretical, it's a hypothesis. It's not actual yet. It's not real yet. It's a theory, and it has an element of utopia in it, in the same way that all theory does. It's a statement about how things ought to be. And it's entirely legitimate to impute to the proletariat this view. You can, imputation's part of everything, really. Like, I don't know, like, what's a good example of this? Like, you can impute interests to any class you want or any group you want. You can say, okay, well, the interests of, US ruling class at the moment, you can impute to them a series of interests and say, well, Trump is a bad leader of the US ruling class because he's not advancing their interests. That's imputation, you know. So anyway, Lukács imputes this theory to the proletariat, but he does so in a way knowing the limits of theoretical imputation and empirical class consciousness. Therefore, we've set up a tension, right, between the imputed class consciousness of the proletariat, their theoretical capability according to Marxists, and empirically what they actually think, which is far less than what the Marxists would like them to think, but also possibly more, because theory abstracted from practice is great. It's utopian, it's abstract. So implicit in all of this, I think, in Lukács is a critique of theory as such, and that's something that often people miss. But the standpoint of the proletariat as an imputation, that is the origin of Marxist theory, yeah, for Lukács. And that's really important because if you combine that view with his critique of theory as such, because the other thing behind this is, why can we look at things theoretically? Because of the contemplative stance, because we're removed from the object of our critique. We're distant from it, and so that invites theory. The moment you're distant from a thing, you can start to theorize it. So theory itself, Marxist theory included, is made possible by the contemplative stance and by reification. But to put it more simply, you can't have a critique of capitalist political economy until you're fully up to your neck in capitalist political economy. We have to be in it to criticize it, have a theory of it. So the immediacy of Marxist theory is an abstract intellectual criticism of capitalism. Yeah? And that's necessary. But by itself, it's not united with practice, it's not capable of changing anything, and also, as by virtue of its abstraction and separation from real practice, it's going to be wrong about a lot of things. Not necessarily wrong about the main theoretical claims, but wrong about the application, or possibly wrong about the main theoretical claims, and through an engagement with history and by learning that's how Marxism has developed. So the task now is to develop theory and the standpoint of the proletariat towards a point where it can engage with actual working class practice in order to generate praxis. Cool. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the development of theory proceeds as such. Marxist theory in its genesis is just, Marx and Engels, just two blokes writing some books, trying to get other people to read them. Great. Well, the next stage is, okay, so you've convinced a handful of people that Marx is worth reading, and, say you're in Germany, and, you've got an organization of 200 people, like 200 odd Marxists in Germany in like the 1860s. And like August Bebel is one of them, maybe. I can't remember if he was around that early, but the progenitors of the organized working class Marxist movement. Well, you're in a sect. Congratulations. That's the organization you have. You have a sect. And a sect, and this is in Lukács. I talk a bit about this because I think it's where Marxism's largely at today. We're organized in sects. But there's nothing inherently, it's not a pejorative necessarily, but it's an organizational form and it's a primitive one. A sect is to a party as a village is to a city. In a sect, everyone knows your name. They know who you're dating. They know how you voted in every meeting. They know what you read, and they largely try and tell you what to read. Sects are closed, traditionalist, not very sophisticated. They rarely have leadership changes. They're not powerful. And at their worst, they're a little bit culty, and at their best, they push towards genuine mass organizing. Yeah. So that's the starting point. But the next stage is, okay, now a mass workers' movement. So we're talking, and the 200 odd Marxists in Germany unite with the Lassalleans. In so doing, they understand that if you can get the Lassalleans on board with this, they'll be doing something that's far better than their theory. And actually, their theory doesn't matter that much. We'll just get them on board a political project that's going forward. And at that point, where you start to have mass Marxist organizing, the Marxist movement ceases to be a purely theoretical movement and starts to become a theoretical movement with practical stakes that can start to lead workers in struggle or in elections or, in unions or what have you. And that's important because this is the first step towards the desublimation of theory and the movement of theory toward practice. Yeah. At the same time, this presupposes the emergence of a workers' movement that is a possible interlocutor. So, you've got parties on the one side, but you've also got the capacity for strikes, the capacity for workers to be interested in this, or like other social groups as well, if you want. I still think the working class is the most powerful class in potential within developed capitalist societies, but, obviously you're going to need to talk to other groups that don't necessarily relate to themselves purely as workers. Anyway, so what we're talking about is a dialectic between theory and practice. Yeah? And that book on Lenin is the best thing to read for an example of how Lukács works this out in a given historical context. In the early days, Russian Marxism, like Plekhanov, was a very small movement, and their basic breakthrough was to say it's not going to be the people that lead a Russian revolution, it's going to be the workers. And that was Plekhanov. But like at this point, Marxism in Russia is sects. But then under Lenin, it starts to build into a mass movement, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And over time, they articulate more and more grounded programs that are capable of engaging more deeply with workers' practice. So in that stage of development, the main problem is going to be reformism. Not necessarily in Russia because it's not a democratic country, unions are illegal, so the question of reformism came through in a very different way there. But if you're going to apply this schema to a country like Australia, we're going to have, I was saying this last night, we're going to have a mass workers' movement, and the main thing it's going to do is reformism. You can do that without being a reformist, but like when you're in the early stages of building a mass movement, that's going to be the main danger. And then finally, the highest stage in the dialectic between theory and practice that Lukács talks about is Bolshevism, or mass revolutionary Marxism. Now, for that to occur, there has to be another thing. The objective crisis of capitalism has to play itself out to a point where there opens up a period that Lukács calls the actuality of revolution. Actuality of revolution is a historical era in which there's such a profound crisis afflicting the totality of society that opens the question of power. And, in his time, that was World War I and the revolutions that immediately followed that. So you can see revolution coming from years before, usually. They certainly could in Russia, they could in Germany, Yeah, when we're at that point, we're dealing with the actuality of revolution. That's necessary because prior to that, workers' practice will simply not be revolutionary to a large enough scale to sustain any meaningful, unity between Marxists and, like revolutionary workers. Prior to the actuality of revolution, it's entirely feasible to build a mass socialist party. That's been done many times, and that's what we need to do. But we can only move towards an actually revolutionary party in the context of actuality of revolution. Prior to that, revolutionary parties will be a small minority. When this happens, now we're in a historical moment where praxis can emerge. And I have a very strict reading of the term praxis. Praxis is not reading, it's not waking up in the morning, going to a Marx reading group and then going to a small rally afterwards. That's like, all of this is purely contemplative. Like, it's fine, it's important to do, but like, it's not praxis because it doesn't change anything. It changes your mind and maybe makes you feel better. And then the protest might, even if the protest is an effective one, say it's a university protest and you get the university to back down about something, fine, well done. But like, it's not changing any social logics. Like, it's not restructuring society. It's entirely compatible with bourgeois society. It's not to say it ought not to be done, but praxis is socially transformative practice. Practice that starts to rewrite the fundamental laws according to which society operates. Yeah? It's the Second All-Russian Congress of the Soviets seizing power. That's praxis. It's a workers' government for the first time in history. Like, that's praxis.
Right, Paris Commune.
A sovereign workers' government over a nation. I take your point. I think basically that was the key thing with the October Revolution. It's the first time the workers' movement had claimed sovereignty over an entire national politics, which is significant because, my disagreement with Lukács on this is Lukács basically repeats the political theology of Bolshevism, but philosophically. The political theology of Bolshevism is that October was a decision of the whole working class. No, it wasn't. It was a decision of Lenin. And it's the decision that is part of what creates sovereignty. The sovereign is who decides over the law and over the exceptions to the law. That's in Hobbes. It goes way back. Like it's in the States. It's Plato's Statesman. Lenin, he's the sovereign. He establishes himself as the first, the first, what was it, chairman of the Council of People's Soviets? I don't know, but like, it's the fucking president of the Soviet Union. And it's quite clear cut how he does it. He convinces the communist, the Bolsheviks to go along with it in a series of increasingly frantic letters. And he turns up on the scene. He's like, "We have to do this." And meanwhile, Trotsky's over at the Putilov Works making excellent speeches about why we have to take power. And then Trotsky organizes the insurrection on the ground, and they lead the insurrection. And it happens a day before the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which is genius timing. And then the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets votes enthusiastically to approve it. So yes, the revolution was sanctioned by the highest and the most comprehensive democratic bodies in Russian society, but it wasn't a decision of the class. Classes don't make decisions. Individuals make decisions. So anyway, that's the point. As an aside, by the way, Soviets are the key institution for Lenin because in a way that parties and unions are not, they can speak in a totalizing manner. they're totalizing institutions. They can represent the whole of the class. A, B, they're political as well because different parties are represented within the Soviets. And C, Soviets are the only class organizations for Lukács which can take over the totality of a society and rewrite its social laws. My own view is that probably in different contexts, unions might play a similar role, like in the Polish Revolution, Solidarność unions. And I don't think we know what it's going to look like in any future revolutionary transformation. But that's another question. So October Revolution is the high point of Praxis. And I only have a few more points to make, and then I'll shut up because I feel like I've gone on for a bit. Cool. So, okay, well, this moment of Praxis vindicates all of Marxist theory. It also represents the desublimation of Marxist theory. It's no longer a theoretical movement, but it's a theoretical practical movement. It's a movement of Praxis. The unity between the Communist Party and the Soviets, i.e. the Communists have a majority in the Soviets, well done. That's the highest vindication of Marxism as a theoretical perspective, but it means Marxism is not just a theoretical perspective, it's a practical perspective. And Praxis is the end result. So that's the culmination of Lukács's philosophy in itself for him. For me, however, it's not the end. So you've got this moment, well then what do you do with it? Well, you recall it. You forever live in the light of a past event, which is tragic. It's nostalgic. 1 year after the Russian Revolution, fair enough, but it's been a while now. It's over 100. So what then do you do? But the way this problem came up concretely in Europe was, how the fuck do we do what the Russians did? They've got no idea. And they're frantically trying to figure out what the Russians did and figure out how to apply it. And all the major attempts fail. And I think largely this is because Marxism in those national contexts was really underdeveloped. This isn't so much Lukács's point as my own, but in no other communist party in Europe is there a sufficiently capable leadership. The leadership, like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht are about as good as you get in Germany, and they get themselves killed. That was a mistake. Lenin managed to avoid that. Well done. But what else? There's Gramsci's in prison. He's having a crack, but
Well, also before that, he was arguing with his party was so split.
Exactly, yeah. So, there's no, and on one level, this was historically inevitable, time travel history doesn't work. So, the way that, typical Trotskyists will talk about it will be what needed to exist in Germany in 1903 was what did exist in Russia in 1917. So what are you going to do? Exactly. It took 1917 to develop these things. So actually, if you have this reading of history, nothing better was possible. That's what I think. That's the problem with history. History is the realm of absolute unfreedom. History doesn't change. You can learn new things about it, but you can never, it's always going to be the way it was. So the only point of those kinds of discussions is to talk about what needs to be done today. Anyway, European communism failed, and it didn't fail because not enough people read Trotsky, obviously. And the Trotskyist movement was born to lose. I mean, my God, it's a movement defined by exile. It literally was. Trotsky's great. Don't get me wrong, it's so much better than Trotskyists. But yeah. So anyway, Lukács is responding to this failure. And so for him, philosophy is a propedeutic to politics. Yeah? And this, for Lukács, philosophy comes before politics. For me, philosophy is at the end of the equation. But I'll say what I mean by that now. So the key chapter on philosophy is the antinomies of bourgeois thought, where he goes from Kant through to Hegel by way of Fichte, Schelling, a couple of others. And what he's doing there is, what he says is, the classical German idealists captured in philosophy and expressed in philosophy the contradictions of bourgeois society. And he thinks they did it in variously wrong ways. He's got a criticism of Kant and of Fichte and of Schelling and of Hegel as well. He's obviously very much pro-Hegel, but he's got a criticism of all of these guys. But for him, each of them builds towards a philosophical critique of reification and of bourgeois society, and the culmination being Marx. Yeah. But what's really going on there that's interesting is it's what someone like Andrew Feenberg would call a metacritique. What I mean by that is we can discern something about the social logics of capitalism by criticizing the most developed intellectual expression of them, namely philosophy. So, the antinomies in someone like Kant is a good example. I mentioned before the contemplative stance in which we're forever exiled from the thing, from the social whole, we're in a powerless position. Well, the problem of the thing in itself and the thing for us in Kant is, for Lukács, a perfectly theoretical representation of this real problem. Because the thing in itself, Philosophers simply always choose the thing that's directly in front of them. It's usually it's a chair, it's a desk, or it's a fucking iPhone. Anyway, that's the thing in itself, right? Well, the things I know about it, they're the thing for me. But there's so much more about this phone than I know, and I could go into infinite detail, and obviously if I know how to make a phone or if I know about the science that goes behind it, I've done well. But there will always be something more about the object that is behind what I know. That's the thing in itself. It's the known unknown about the object. Yeah? You can do the same thing for nature or for anything really. Like the closer you look at a thing, the more there will be. There's an infinite in every moment and in every object. And if you wish to go down that rabbit hole, you can, and it's fascinating. But even then, there'll never be an end. So for Kant, this is simply an eternal problem. And for Lukács, that replicates the relationship between subject and object in bourgeois society. For Hegel, the thing in itself is already always our own knowledge anyway. It's simply the moment of negativity implicit in all knowledge. So the thing in itself, as the thing that we do not know, is the condition of knowing. So for Hegel, the thing in itself is already a moment of the thing for us, and the movement of negativity is what generates thought. That's Kant versus Hegel in 30 seconds. Anyway, the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit is the best single thing to read on that. The preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit is that's the best serious, the one serious thing by Hegel that everyone should read. The preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Forget the philosophy of history. I know there's people like that one, but it's the phenomenology that matters. Anyway, so for Lukács, going through all of this is a way to do a meta-critique of bourgeois society, and it helps inform a better politics. For me, the way I would read it would be to say, well, we've done the politics, and obviously we're still politically invested, but the only thing we can salvage from Lukács's 1920s work is philosophy. That's the only thing that matters anymore about it. The programmatic debates are useful, but they're useful insofar as they help us develop a better Marxist philosophy. And so what I would argue is the standpoint of the proletariat and of Marxism is necessarily incomplete, and that Lukács's articulation of it hedges it all on one event, the emergence of Praxis in historical context. But that is already melancholic, it's nostalgic, and it's a bit nihilistic. And it's also pure theory. It's no longer practice. Insofar as we're simply recollecting events, we're just doing theory. We're just doing it in a more historical register. So the thing that's beyond that is philosophy. And that's a standpoint which knows itself through its own negativity. So it's not a collective standpoint, it's an individual work, but I would argue it's a standpoint that allows us to shed light on different theoretical bodies of work like Marxism. And it gives us determinate freedom within those. So it means we can reread Marxism and we can rewrite Marxism in order to be capable of developing a new truth in our present, without linking it to some reified claim about nature, about science, about history, or what have you. So I think the significance of Lukács is he's a pathway into philosophy. He's a gateway drug. You read Lukács, then you go and read Hegel. And congratulations, now you're doing philosophy. And then that gives you a standpoint with which you can criticize Marxism more rationally and coherently. That's Lukács, according to me.